Before democracy. You may have heard about democracy, but what is it? Democracy is a system of decision-making in an institution, organization, or country in which all members have an equal share of power. Typically, this means everyone has a right to vote on how the organization or country is run. Throughout history, most political systems have been headed by a monarch, a king, queen, emperor, or empress. Under a democracy, the leaders are elected through voting and elections. The winning candidates in an election then assume the position to which they were elected, and they should follow the wishes of the people who voted them into power. Wise men systems. About 3,000 years ago, in areas such as the Middle East, there were forms of government that included leadership by elders or wise men. They ran cities or had the political power to decide on major issues such as war. Although these governments were not truly democratic with elected leaders, they were not led by monarchs. Sparta's early democracy. An early attempt at democracy in the 7th century BC occurred in a state called Sparta in the south of Greece. Sparta's system was unusual in the ancient world because it had 2 kings as well as different groups who shared power. One group was called the ephors. New ephors were elected every year. The ephors were 5 men who were elected by Spartan citizens. Another group consisted of 30 elders. These elders had to be over 60 years old and were elected for life. These groups were formed to watch over each other to ensure one group did not become too powerful. In Sparta's system, most of the real power rested with a very small number of people. It was not a true democracy, but it was a step in that direction. The first real democracy. In the 5th century BC in Athens, there was an experiment to form the first democracy. Because the population was small, about 50,000 males over the age of 18, it made the communication of ideas easy. It also made an effective voting system possible. The power of the vote was given to adult male citizens who owned land. The main democratic body of Athens was the assembly. The assembly met at least once a month, usually 2 or 3 times a month, at the top of a hill called Nyx. About 4,000 to 5,000 citizens went. Voting was done by a show of hands. Many things were discussed and decided upon at the assembly. The assembly voted on treaties to be signed, the organization of food supplies, and even military leaders. The Athenian democracy had many checks and balances. There was a council of 500 citizens chosen every year who could make emergency decisions. There was a chosen executive committee. There were even chosen military leaders. Citizens were even selected randomly to serve on juries during court cases. If a citizen acted badly, the others could vote that person out of Athens for 10 years. This was mostly for people who became too powerful or dangerous. It made sure that people in power acted responsibly. All this came to an end after the death of Alexander the Great, when Athens tried to expand its powers but failed. The Macedonian people replaced the political system in Athens with their own oligarchy. A form of democracy did return to Athens eventually, but it would be more than 2,000 years before other attempts to give real power to the people were made. The Roman Republic. In the 3rd century BC, Rome was a republic. Roman citizens elected representatives to rule on their behalf. It was not perfect. The rich were in charge. Common citizens had a voice but had no real power. By the 1st century BC, these democratic measures, broken as they were, had been replaced by an emperor. Italian communes. After the fall of the Roman Empire in the 11th to 13th centuries, many of the people in the towns in northern Italy came together and promised to protect each other. These allegiances were called communes, and they were run by a town council of elected members. Over time, these communes held great power in their areas, effectively becoming independent states within Italy. In the beginning, every male citizen could vote in the local assembly called an arengo. But in time, merchants came to power in these assemblies, and the leaders in the arengo found ways to keep their power. The leadership was then controlled by a few rich families, returning these towns to oligarchies. The formation of parliaments. The idea of a parliament appeared in the 12th century in Europe. In French, parliament means a place of speaking. However, a parliament was typically made up of the noble families, such as lords and dukes, and the leaders of the church. This council would advise the king or queen on important matters. In time, ordinary citizens, most often rich, powerful men, were allowed to join the parliament, but abuse of power was common. The Magna Carta of 1215 was a British document written to protect the population from the abuse of power of the English king, protect religious rights, and protect citizens from illegal acts by the monarch. A democratic constitution. The American Constitution, signed in 1787, was the first formal document outlining a democracy. The Constitution created the presidency, the Senate to which 2 members from each state are elected, and the House of Representatives with the number of members elected from each state depending on its population. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution are called the Bill of Rights, signed in 1791. These amendments guarantee freedom of religion and of speech. They also protect the property of citizens and people's rights in a court of law. There have been additional amendments since 1791, but the original Constitution has provided an admirable example of flexibility, allowing a nation to adjust its laws to the needs of the times. Votes for women. During the middle of the 19th century, more and more women began to call out for the right to vote all over the world. In the United States, this happened at about the same time as the movement to ban slavery. Wyoming was the first state to give women the right to vote in 1869. However, it would not be until 1920 that women were given the right to vote nationwide. The 19th Amendment guarantees all American women the right to vote. In Britain, the movement for women's rights was shorter but more violent. Tired of waiting on the middle-class movement, a more active group was organized by Emily Pankhurst. These suffragettes, as they were called, broke laws and were not afraid to use violence. They tied themselves to buildings, went on hunger strikes, and raised the issue in political meetings. Many were sent to jail. In 1918, during World War I, many people noticed the important role that women had played in the war as nurses or by working in factories. Because of this, British women over 30 were given the right to vote. By 1928, this was changed to be the same age as men. The United States and Britain were not the first places to give women democratic voting rights. The first was the Isle of Man in 1881, followed by New Zealand, 1893, and Australia, 1902. Post-World War II. The end of World War II planted the seeds for democracy in many countries. At this time, many former British colonies such as India, Pakistan, and a number of countries in Africa gained independence. Many of them adopted democratic governments, but it took time for them to set up models that worked in their cultures. India held its first democratic elections in 1952, making it the world's largest democratic state. In the 1970s, waves of democracy swept across Southern Europe, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and several Arab, Central Asian, and African states. In 1900, there were few countries in the world with voting rights for all. By 2000, 120 of the world's 192 nations were democratic, and a further 16 had partial democracy. Democracy today. In the 21st century, democratic governments formed in Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, Jordan, and elsewhere in the Middle East. Democracy also took root in Myanmar and Bhutan. However, some nations still restrict the rights of their citizens to vote freely to elect their leaders. History tells us that the movement to give voice to a nation's people is a powerful one, but history is, as yet, incomplete. When will all the citizens of the world be allowed to have a voice in the affairs of their countries and to help guide their nations into the future?